Hello and welcome to the BSI Education Podcast with me, Matthew Childs.
And me, Alan Sellers.
Hello, Alan. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. And how are you, Matthew?
I'm very well, thank you. Now, in these podcasts, our aim is to bring you the stories behind standards and standardisation. In this episode, we focus on the issue that in recent months has dominated all of our lives, not just in this country, but around the world, COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge impact on people and communities, and we know that organisations are facing significant disruptions and challenges that they need to quickly manage and respond to.
For this episode, we welcome back our guests from episode 3 of the podcast, Sally Swingewood and Martin Cottam. Sally is Lead Standards Development Manager within the Governance and Resilience sector at BSI. Sally is responsible for the UK standards development and the UK contribution to several international management standards. Martin is Group Technical Assurance and Quality Director at Lloyd's Register. He's their voice on occupational health and safety. Martin has been active in standards development since the 1990s. He currently chairs Technical Committee 283 for Health and Safety Management Systems.
Together, Sally and Martin describe how BSI is working with a range of experts to share best practice and provide practical steps to support safe working for organisations large and small. We really enjoyed our conversation with Sally and Martin, and we hope you do too. So, in this episode of the podcast, we are delighted to be joined once again by Sally Swingewood and Martin Cottam. Hello, Sally, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Matthew.
And hello, Martin, how are you?
I'm very well too, thank you.
Really great to have you back. Sally, if I could turn to you first, can you tell us a little bit about your role at BSI?
I'm a Lead Standards Development Manager at BSI. I work on business improvement and on occupational health and safety management. So I look after the national committees for standards in those areas, and I also manage the international committee for occupational health and safety management.
And Martin, can you tell us a bit about Lloyd's Register and your role there?
Yes, sure. So I'm the Group Technical Assurance and Quality Director for Lloyd Register Group, which is a global organisation providing professional services for engineering and technology, with a particular focus on improving safety and increasing the performance of critical infrastructure. So my role there relates both to quality management and to technical governance. My activities in the world of standards are more focused in the area of occupational health and safety, an area I've been involved with for a while. And in that capacity, I chair the ISO Technical Committee responsible for OH&S management.
Now, in these podcasts, we're always keen to learn about the standards journey of our guests. So how did you get here, and what's your standards journey been? How about you, Sally?
I've been working in standards for 7 years now. I came here quite by accident through a series of odd turns and events, and primarily, I guess, through some colleagues of mine who work at BSI who recognised that this was a world that I would thrive in, and they were right. I feel very lucky to be here. So I began in standards knowing very little, but was thrown right in at the deep end working on ISO 9001 quality management systems, which is the world's biggest standard, and also in the initial development stages of ISO 45001, the first global occupational health and safety management standard.
Well, that sounds quite action to standards there. And how about you, Martin?
Well, I've been involved in the British Standards Committee for Occupational Health and Safety Management for a little over 20 years. I got involved because I moved into a role within Lloyd's Register, which was to establish the company's offering in relation to OHS management system certification. That was really the period in which certification for OHS was first getting underway, and companies who were familiar with that process for things like quality management and environmental management were taking a keen interest in having something equivalent for occupational health and safety. So in taking on that role within Lloyd's Register, it was suggested to me that it would be perhaps helpful and useful to me to get involved with the British Standards Committee, which itself had developed British guidance standards on OHS, which were being used as reference points, and also because there was a debate going on about whether to propose the development of an ISO standard on OHS management systems. So I got involved to contribute to that debate at that time, and have remained on the committee ever since. I chaired it through the period when ISO 45001 was being developed, and then moved across to chair the new ISO technical committee, which was established to look after the OHS activities within ISO going forward.
Thanks both. It sounds like you both have people that have suggested this space for you to be in and you haven't left yet, so they've done a good job there.
Once you come in, Alan, you don't leave. It grabs you.
Now, obviously, COVID-19 has had a huge impact on individuals and organisation communities around the world. From a BSI perspective, Sally, what's been BSI's response to COVID-19?
We've been very active in our response right from the beginning, really. We had requests from government to assist. Initially, primarily with the ventilator challenge. As you are aware, in the UK, we had a shortage of ventilators. A lot of organisations were scrambling to build ventilators and distribute them at speed, often organisations that hadn't made these before. So part of the BSI response was to make standards freely available, and that included the ventilator standards, but also standards on personal protective equipment and on face masks. And we put a lot of guidance onto our website. Essentially, we put a package together of things that we thought would help organisations during this time. Specific requests for hygiene standards, for example, but also crisis management, continuity management, risk management, resilience. And we've also produced a lot of free webinars on these, which are still available on our website. We've put together a white paper, I think that was working with the Scottish Government, drawing on the experience and horizon scanning of working during the pandemic across lots of different sectors, including the CBI, which, CIPD, construction. And then, of course, we developed the Safe Working Guidance document.
So can you tell us a bit more about the Safe Working Guidance document?
The Safe Working Guidelines were really a response to the rather fragmented information that was coming out from government, from the WHO, from other places. As our knowledge of COVID-19 developed and as the risks changed and we became more aware of what was happening, what we intended with these guidelines was to produce a single space that people could go to help them get back to work. Obviously, a lot of organisations had to cease operations very suddenly, and this threw our economy into turmoil. And then workers were also, and organisations, employers too, were very nervous about reopening because whilst the economic factors are very important, people also didn't want to put lives at risk. So this is a generic set of guidelines. It's broadly applicable to any organisation, no matter what they do, how big they are, how small they are. It reflects good, trusted advice.
How have they been produced? What sort of organisations have been involved in the process?
They've been produced slightly differently to our usual way of working for standards, which, as I'm sure many people are aware, can take a very long time. Clearly, we didn't have a year or two to get these together. That wouldn't have been helpful to anyone. So they were produced by internally. We developed a draft based on all of the available guidance, rules, knowledge at the time. This was in May. And then we put together an advisory group of experts from our BSI committees covering a broad range of people. Martin, you're on the advisory group. Perhaps you'd like to say a little bit more about who was involved?
Yes, sure, Sally. I mean, I think it's very striking how effective that mechanism has been. I was very happy to contribute, obviously, because of my involvement in the OH&S committee. But I've certainly been struck that within that relatively small group, and correct me if I've got the numbers wrong, but I'm guessing there must be a dozen or so people who've been joining most of those calls. There's a real breadth of different perspectives being brought to bear depending on the different areas of specialism that people have. So I've certainly learnt a great deal myself on others' perspectives on the issue, and therefore it's highlighted to me some things that were not in my mind particularly as challenges which need to be reflected in the guidance. So I think the power of the standards network has certainly been very evident in BSI's ability to rapidly bring together a very diverse group of inputs from the advisory group members.
With all of our standards, they are open to public consultation as part of a development process. Has there been a public consultation for the guidance too on safe working?
Absolutely. This has been a critical part of our development, particularly as we have been working at speed and without the usual frequent but long iterations and consultations with different levels of experts and then the general public. So we went from initial draft to publication of the first version in, I believe it was 15 days. And on day 15, it went out for public consultation. That initial public consultation was then used, the comments that we received were then used to produce the second version. And on the day that published, it went back out for public consultation. It's still in consultation now. It closes in a couple of days, and we will use the comments on that consultation to produce the third version.
Might be worth it just expanding a bit, Sally, on the difference between guidance and a standard. Obviously, this is being produced by BSI as the national standards body. But what's the difference? Why is this guidance and not a standard?
Well, you can have guidance standards. So I think that's the first thing to clarify. People do get confused about that. But we are not calling this a standard simply because it hasn't gone through the rigorous, long process that we use to develop full standards. So to call it a standard, we must meet various criteria, which due to the times involved in this, we couldn't do. However, it has been written as a standard. It follows the same format as a standard, for example, but it is guidelines. It's not requirements.
So you mentioned earlier that we have version 2 of the guidelines now. What are the main changes from version 1 to version 2?
Version 2 is greatly expanded on version 1, down to the changing situation, our changing knowledge, and also the input we received from the comments from the public and experts in our committees and on our advisory group. So in version 2, we have brand new clauses, for example, on working from home, on diversity, on accessibility, on the use of toilets. Toilets has been a very hot topic because obviously they're fairly fundamental, but also carry quite a degree of risk in terms of them being shared spaces and hygiene issues. Martin, is there anything else you can think of that we put in?
I think you touched on inclusion, didn't you, a second ago, Sally? But I think that was an important additional dimension that certainly I was very struck by, was the recognition of some of the particular challenges that need to be recognised and addressed with these new ways of working. So whether that's the fact that with face masks and all the other protection, in some cases visors, that can have quite an impact on people's ability to communicate, to hear. So those who perhaps rely on a degree of lip reading or have other problems with hearing will find that very difficult. There are people, of course, who depend on the use of support animals, whether that's guide dogs for the blind, as we tend to term it, or other animals for hearing dogs and so on. The sense that we need to remember in our efforts to make everybody safe that we don't also create great barriers for particular groups by making it very difficult for them if we haven't thought of their requirements in advance.
We also included in version 2 specific guidance on how to deal with instances of illness in the workplace, whether it's your workers or the public, your customers, for example, and what to do if there are outbreaks of COVID-19 in your organisation. I think one of the things we've stressed in version 2 that we perhaps did less of in version 1 is the need for a community spirit here, a supportive atmosphere, a transparent culture. There is some stigma in some areas about potentially having COVID-19. And this can lead to people hiding symptoms, which of course can lead to community outbreaks. So the guidance on that and when organisations should report incidents to the authorities, I think is quite an important inclusion.
It sounds like there's a lot of work that's gone into that in a very short space of time to produce guidelines that sound very comprehensive. And I'm interested to note the difference between the speed at which these guidelines have been produced and as you've commented, the pace at which standards are developed. And I'd like to know a bit more about that comparison. So for me, consensus is the thing that standards are always aiming to achieve. Is there something about consensus within these guidelines that is less than what you might have in a standard?
Yes, in as much as we are not putting this out for ballot to approve publication. However, our advisory group is our consensus building mechanism. So they will be revised, the guidelines will be revised at speed, taking the comments into account, distributed to the advisory group. The advisory group will review them, and then we will have a meeting to discuss any areas that are perhaps contentious or need further work. So we do still have the consensus building, but it's at a smaller scale necessarily, because the more people you involve, the longer everything takes.
That's fascinating. It sounds like an interesting process for developing a set of guidelines or maybe even a standard at a speed that those within the standards community would be surprised at, I think.
Yes, and I think it's opened our eyes in BSI as the UK's national standards body to the fact that we can work differently and that we can be flexible when there is a need to be flexible. So I think we will have learnt some good lessons out of this. I mean, this has literally been a drop everything else project. There was no time to work on anything else other than this to deliver at the pace that we did. But there are times when, of course, that's very useful.
So are these guidelines being proposed as a full standard?
Yes, they are. They're currently being balloted in the ISO Technical Committee for Health and Safety Management that Martin and I manage together. And we are hoping to have a two-stage response to this. Martin, if you'd like to explain a little bit more.
What we're proposing to do is to take the BSI document, I guess it will be version 3 or possibly even beyond that by the time the work might commence, and take that as the base document and starting point for development of an ISO document. Now, initially, we envisage publishing that as a so-called publicly available specification, a PAS, published through ISO. And that again is a document or a route through which documents can be published on a more fast-track basis. And therefore, that's achieved by perhaps having slightly lower thresholds for the balloting processes and consensus building than, again, a full standard would require. But our thinking is that if we can publish something through that route relatively quickly, we could immediately move into the process, if you like, of them further developing it with further stakeholder input in order to enable it then to transition to being a full guidance standard at our ISO level. So that's the route that we're proposing to follow. That's currently being balloted at the moment. And it will be an interesting challenge, I think, and you alluded to this earlier with your question, Alan, about an interesting challenge to see just how agile and adept we can be with that mechanism in the ISO process. I think virtual working actually offers us some potential for more effective and faster working in some respects. I know initially we've perhaps all struggled with the idea that we can't meet in the way we've been familiar with, but actually in many respects operating virtually through Zoom calls and so on can actually produce more focused and targeted meetings where you can really drive into specific issues and resolve them quite effectively. And so in some ways there are advantages there for us.
Martin, I'm interested in timing there. Both Sally and yourself have have talked about how BSI and stakeholders have provided a rapid response to a fast-moving situation. I suppose my question is why propose or why move to have an international standard now if the guidelines are effective and you've moved from version 1 to version 2 to version 3? Why at this point in our response to COVID-19 is an international standard important?
Well, I guess we should probably await the result of the current ballot, Matthew, in some respects, because that will tell us the answer to the question of whether internationally, through that network of national standards bodies, of course, BSI being one, there is a consensus that it would be beneficial to have a document in the ISO space as a fully international document. Or, I suppose, alternatively, if people feel comfortable to use the BSI document, that it's a very valuable document and there is already considerable international interest in it. But in terms of the level of international participation, that's really where there was an opportunity, I think, by moving into the ISO space to increase the participation from other countries and therefore to share experience more widely from a wider range of countries, all of whom have somewhat different experiences and are on a somewhat different trajectory in their efforts to manage the current their response to the current pandemic. So I think that's probably the main reason, a differentiator, if you like, between the two processes. What we have heard quite clearly from webinars that Sally and I have conducted are voices saying that a document at international level would be useful. Certainly a group we spoke to, quite a large group of people who joined us for a webinar that was jointly organised by ISO and UNIDO. There was quite a real sense of strong views from that particular group that they would find it useful to see some activity in the ISO arena to help develop guidance, because there are, of course, countries who are less well equipped, perhaps, in some ways to deal with the situation that they're facing, and the opportunity to share experience with and from others is really valuable to them.
I think also it's pretty obvious from the news that in some countries the response to the pandemic has become very political. By producing international standard, an ISO standard, to a degree, I think it may help some countries and some organisations in countries, and particularly those organisations that are working in multiple countries, to have a non-political response, to have an internationally agreed set of guidelines and good practice. May take some of the heat out of the politics around all of this response.
So obviously, COVID-19 and global pandemics are once in 100-year occurrences. So why develop a standard around a response to a pandemic?
Well, I think there's several reasons for this. One of which is that science seems to be indicating that pandemics may become more frequent. So it may be that we need to be better prepared in the long run than we were this time. And I think the other part of that is that we do not know how long this particular situation will be with us and how long we're going to have to deal with COVID-19 itself. And then, of course, the other side of that is whether we are in a pandemic situation or not, we are always in a situation where there are communicable diseases.
So in terms of next steps then, where are we in the process from the guidance becoming a full standard?
Our current position is that the BSI document will undergo one further iteration in parallel with the ongoing ballot regarding the initiation of a piece of work in ISO, Matthew. So I think Sally mentioned earlier that there's a current consultation, public consultation in progress on the BSI document, version 2. That consultation closes in a couple of days' time and will lead to the publication of version 3. And then, subject to a successful outcome with the ballot at ISO, effectively that's when the focus will switch across to the development of an ISO document, initially an ISO PAS, publicly available specification, The ballot I've just referred to closes on the 11th of September. Now, that ballot has asked national standards bodies not just to answer the question, do you approve this development, do you wish it to proceed, but also to submit comments, i.e. those detailed technical comments on the document that they've been circulated, which is the BSI document, so that there will be an initial input immediately to enable the work to proceed. So if we get the green light at the 11th of September, then we will start an immediate piece of work to review and incorporate those comments into another iteration of the document. That will then be issued through national standards bodies internationally for an 8-week consultation. And if we can stick to that quite ambitious time frame, we can, in theory, and hopefully will, publish that PAS around the end of this calendar year. And then, of course, we would begin a further cycle along that journey to create a full international standard.
So obviously developing standards or guidance and standards at this time has been a very unique experience. I suppose, Martin, from your perspective, what have you learned from this experience?
I think for me, I've been really struck, Matthew, by the power of those diverse stakeholder inputs and the speed which, in fact, you can then work at if you've got, can marshal those resources together. And I think I've also been very conscious, related to that we're very much on a journey of learning here, in that everybody's focus 2-3 months ago was on very immediate and short-term actions that needed to be taken. And gradually we're broadening our horizons collectively and beginning to see more and more things which also need to be factored in. And that's, I think, very much reflected in what we've described earlier in terms of the addition of new content into the BSI guidelines with each successive iteration. So, just one example of that, I think, is that, we've moved now to so many organizations now making so much more use of their websites to engage with customers, stakeholders, and other people. And again, back to that point of inclusion, we've got to remember to think about the aspect of making sure that that website design is in a form that's accessible to everybody. And so all those issues around, the visual presentation, the colours on the screen, the contrast, all of that which we would perhaps normally think about, but perhaps haven't been able to think about in the haste to adapt our organisations' ways of working to the pandemic situation, we do need to address those, because otherwise we are excluding people without perhaps even realising it.
And Sally, from a national standards body perspective, the key learnings?
I think, again, it comes back to flexibility, to agility, that just because we've always done something in a certain way and have always said, no, we can't do that, doesn't mean it's true. The world has changed very rapidly for everybody this year. And we have achieved things that we would previously have said were impossible. And we have put processes in place, we've put safeguards in place that we would never have thought of before. And I think from a business point of view, one of the key learnings should be that being agile in responding to the current situation is absolutely critical, because that situation keeps changing and it will keep changing. So I think not just from a standards point of view, but from an economic operation point of view, staying flexible, staying agile, and staying on top of the movable world that we live in is key to success.
I think from an OH&S perspective, Sally, you'd probably agree with me that I think one of the good things which we might look back on this period and see as a moment of progress is that I think many more organisations now have a great deal more sensitivity to and interest in the issue of workers' mental health and well-being.
Absolutely. We are seeing now that the pandemic has had a huge effect on people's mental health and well-being, and Organisations are still learning how to deal with that, how to support their workers in the best possible way. Individuals are still working out how to deal with that. But as Martin says, hopefully a positive that will come out of this is for the long term, everybody will understand that your mental health is just as important as your physical health.
And of course, that makes it very timely that one of the activities in the ISO technical committee at the moment is indeed the development of ISO 45003, which is guidance very much on all those issues around mental health and safety.
Before we finish, I just want to say that to find out more about BSI education, go to www.bsigroup.com/education. This link and others on the theme of this episode can be found in the episode notes. Do please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and share us on social media using the hashtag BSIEdPod. And if you have any comments, suggestions, questions, or ideas for future podcasts, then do please get in touch at education@bsigroup.com. We welcome your feedback. All that remains is for me to say thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks, Sally. And thank you, Martin.
And of course, to thank you all for listening.